Excellent.
Here we go. So today I decided to well, welcome first of all, and I am so glad that there are so many people here from all around the world. I think this is really exciting. Just to, I do quite a lot of Zoom things these days, and they're mostly poetry workshops or meditation workshops. So it's really nice to have my Snuff Bottle family here. Welcome. And today what I want to talk about is not Guyue Xuan bottles precisely, but I want to talk about how we did the research that got us to where we are, understanding what Guyue Xuan actually is, as a mark on the base of enamel on glass bottles, and if in fact we are at the end of this story, or if this mystery has more to be uncovered. So what I did was I went back through every single reference that I could find for Guyue Xuan, and I came across lots of fascinating things which diverted me completely from what I was meant to be doing. But so I'm going to present in a chronological order these references, and hopefully I won't do it in too dry a way, but you're welcome to leave if it gets really too much. I came across this in Country Life magazine from 1954, this wonderful quote, which says, "Collecting Chinese snuff bottles is like making an indoor flower garden in miniature, nor is it a very much more costly hobby than growing flowers." And that was from the very eminent English scholar Winkworth. So if you want to send me your snuff bottle collections, I'll send you a bunch of flowers. So what we're talking about today is the mark which translates as Old Moon Pavilion, or sometimes you see it as Ancient Moon Pavilion. And in Wade Giles, which was the English form of writing Chinese from 1892, it's written, the top one, Guyue Xuan, and in Pinyin, which is what we use now, which was established in 1979, it's Guyue Xuan. So you see, when you're reading things, for example, if you read the Lilla Perry book, you will see the Wade Giles version written, but they are completely interchangeable. It's just that nowadays we use the Pinyin version. So the first reference that I found in Chinese was in 1880, and it was from Zhao Zhiqian, the literatus, and he wrote about snuff bottles. This was translated by Richard Lynn in our journal in autumn 1991, if you want to read the whole article. But he wrote about Guyue Xuan as follows, or what we think probably was Guyue Xuan. He says three things relating to this. Separate from these, and he's talking about glass bottles first, but then he says, separate from these, there is another type, the Guyue Xuan, which has a white ground and is painted with enamels. So that, I think, would be something like this. Then another quote says, there are also those with painted enamel decoration where short poems are inscribed in empty spaces with the base inscribed Guyue Xuan. Those that are inscribed Qianlong Nianzhe, made in the Qianlong period, are especially beautiful. And so this bottle actually has a Tang Dynasty poem about lotuses, which is the subject on the front. And it has a Guyue Xuan mark on the base, but interestingly, it also has a seal on the side which just says Guyue, which is very interesting. And the third quote that I found, he said, there are also those that are carved with mountains of the immortals, with pavilion towers, rare birds and wondrous beasts, all decorated with enamels. So here he's very definitely talking about snuff bottles. In 1880, there was, in English, there was an album written by William Bragg, which Hugh discusses on his website, Bibliotheca Nicotiana, a catalogue of books about tobacco, together with a catalogue of objects connected with the use of tobacco in all its forms. So Bragg does not mention Guyue Xuan, the Old Moon Pavilion, at all. It just doesn't come up, and there are no bottles illustrated that would look like the Guyue Xuan type that we're used to. In these other early books, Marcus Hewish, Chinese Snuff Bottles of Stone, Porcelain and Glass in 1895, Matun M. Curtis, 1935, The Book of Snuff and Snuff Boxes, and Henry Hitt, that's actually a second edition, 1945. None of those books mention Guyue Xuan at all either. But if we go back to 1902, Mr. Hippisley of the Maritime Customs wrote a pamphlet which he entitled Ceramic Art in China. And this is the first point where I think the sort of mystery of Guyue Xuan sort of starts to unfold. He writes about a Mr. Hu as a maker of Guyue Xuan wares. And this idea of Mr. Hu being somehow involved with Guyue Xuan is repeated numerous times by writers, like in 1935, there was Lee Ashton and Basil Gray wrote a book about ceramics. They mentioned Mr. Hu in relation to Guyue Xuan, and Warren Cox in 1944 did the same thing. So what started to happen at this time was that imperial ceramics, and we're not talking about snuff bottles, but vases and bowls and that kind of thing, somehow became so connected to the Guyue Xuan name. And that's kind of stuck around, and that's caused a lot of issues. So if we jump to today and look at, if you look online at the Freer and Sackler galleries at the Smithsonian, you will see bowls like this, which are imperial bowls with either Yongcheng or Qianlong marks. In 1902, the Smithsonian said in a report, "Every artistic and technical skill has been lavished on these little gems, which are certainly among the masterpieces, if not the masterpieces, of ceramic art in China." And they're specifically talking about Guyue Xuan. And if you go to, if you look at the bowl in the top left corner with the pink enamel vignettes on it and the mille fleurs design, when you look at what they say about it, amongst other things, they talk about it came from Yamanaka in 1929. But if you look on the left-hand side under style, they call it, in 2020, they're still calling it Guyue Xuan ware. Even this bowl, which is underglazed blue and white, they're calling it Guyue Xuan ware. And this is one with a Yongcheng mark, and it's Yongcheng mark and period, so 1723 to 35. And this is the rest of the label about it. If you look at the keywords, if you go onto their website and search under Guyue Xuan, which is what I did, hoping to find a snuff bottle, these imperial porcelains come up. But also what comes up, which is very useful, are some published references. So we have, and I'll discuss some of these later, the one that I couldn't find, and if anybody has that reference, is the one, 1, 2, 3, 4 down, by Spendlove, Guyue Xuan Imperial Porcelain, Volume 10. So if anybody has that, throw it my way. In 1928, there was this kind of continued from 1902 onwards. So in 1928, a magazine called Old Furniture, Volume 3, published this, a porcelain bottle, but it's obviously a vase in the Guyue Xuan style, Qianlong period. And that's from the Getty. So then we jump to, from there, the next reference that I really could get hold of was in 1934. R.L. Hobson, who, in a catalogue of Chinese pottery and porcelain in the collection of Sir Percival David, he actually talked about Guyue Xuan in some detail, and he puts forward 3 theories about the mark. And he has gone back to talking about both glass and ceramics, which perpetuated the growing confusion at that point. So one theory, and a shout out to Sotheby's for the Harry Garner vase, which has just sold. One theory, he said the art name of one who, again this man, who distinguished himself as a maker and decorator of glass. He goes on to say, the story goes that the emperor admired some finely enameled opaque glass of Hu's manufacture and requested Tang Ying, who was the superintendent of the imperial porcelain works at Jingdezhen, to reproduce its qualities in porcelain. This implies a porcelain with decoration in the style of Hu's glass. His second theory, he said, another account makes the Guyue Xuan a pavilion in the palace precincts, in which it is said that some of the choicest porcelains were decorated by specially appointed artists, and the seals attached to the poems which occur on these wares are held to be the signature of these artists. His third theory makes the Guyue Xuan a pavilion in which the best porcelain of the period, the early 18th century, was preserved. And this includes all Guyue Xuan wares, all the exquisite pieces which are distinguished by a rain mark or a hallmark in raised enamel. But again, that they're talking, I think he's talking about ceramics again. So that was in 1934. A year later, B.A. de Veerley in Burlington magazine, December 1935, he, again, I think is talking about ceramics, says specimens of Guyue Xuan are frequently appraised by native connoisseurs as more precious than jade. And this is no figure of speech. And these masterpieces of miniature painting find equal appreciation in the Occident. The same year, Lee Ashton and Basil Gray in Chinese Art note that a celebrated director of the Imperial Glassworks around 1730, so then we're not in Qianlong, we're still in the Yongcheng period, was named Hu, and is said to have fashioned opaque glass vessels with carved designs and painted clear glass with colored enamels. And he says that they say the Chinese character for the name Hu is made up of 2 characters, being Guyue or Old Moon. So it could be read either way. So if you look at this mark, if you take the reading from right to left, the first 2 characters, Gu Ye, if you combine those, that makes the name Hu. So that's what they're talking about, that basically the maker has disguised his name on the base of a bottle. So by now we have this very well-established legend that, or myth, that imperial wares, ceramics, sometimes glass, but definitely imperial, are part of the Guyue Xuan style. And Warren Cox, in the book in 1944, in the book of Pottery and Porcelain, carries on to talk about this. He says, at Peking were imperial glass factories under the supervision of an artist whose name was Hu. As the component parts of the written character Hu, if separated, read Guyue, meaning ancient moon, naturally enough, Hu adopted the studio name of Guyue Xuan, meaning ancient moon pavilion. This glass was made in the Yongcheng as well as the Qianlong Rains, and the emperor once expressed his admiration for the painting with the enamel on it and wished that the same effect could be produced upon porcelain, whereupon Tang Ying set out to make porcelain that looked like the glass, and also did his best to copy the Guyue Xuan style of decoration, consisting of floral designs and landscapes with figures, at times in foreign taste, very delicately painted, and with an unusual amount of light and shade, while being at the same time in the softest of colors. The glass was translucent, and the porcelain gave a semblance of the material in its milky texture and glassy finish. By this time, people were starting to question what this all actually meant, because you don't generally get, if ever, makers' names, or very, very rarely, on imperial pieces. And talking about ceramics and glass being in the Guyue Xuan style, but having to have imperial rain marks, was just becoming just very, very confusing. So 1949, in Oriental Art magazine, Sheila York Hardy, who was Sir Percival David's wife, wrote an article called Guyue Xuan, A New Hypothesis. So Lilla Perry, when she read that article in subsequent years, was not at all convinced by what she was saying. But Hugh Moss went back to it, and he stated that it did lay out an attempt to clarify and debunk some of the myths, including a very random one that had sprung up, whereby the character Hu also means fox, which apparently in Chinese superstition can never be written. So if the character is split into Guyue, the fox spirit is not going to be offended. She writes also about the previous ideas I've mentioned, stating that there's no record of a Mr. Hu at the palace, which there wasn't. There was another theory that had sprung up, that Mr. Hu was Hu Chu, a glassmaker from Suzhou, who was ordered to the palace and made director of the imperial glassworks. Again, no record in the palace of this. And then another very interesting reference that she found in 1931 that I can't find, but I'll take her word for it. And this is, to me, is one of the most interesting early references. Guyue Xuan was reported as being a pavilion of the imperial palace. But she questions why in all of Qianlong's poems, and she states that there were 42,000 of Qianlong's poems. I thought it was 36,000, but hey, who's counting? Why in all of his poems and writings does he never mention the Guyue Xuan? 1952, so a couple of years later, Soame Jennings, again in a ceramics book, Later Chinese Porcelain, says the finest of Guyue Xuan pieces are rare, costly, and obviously palace production. Mr. Yang Xiaoku, in his exhaustive study of Guyue Xuan, which was printed in Beijing in 1934, lists only 103 pieces known to him. And again, we're talking just about imperial ceramics at this point, of which 50 are in the palace collections. There are, he thinks, less than 20 genuine pieces in Europe and America together, and not more than 6 in Japan. According to the Shouzu, they are the finest of all of the productions of the Qing Manchu dynasty, and as their price was astounding, many imitations were made which were correspondingly costly. 1954, the Country Life had an article on Chinese snuff bottles, finally, by Winkworth. And he said, the only literature dealing with the makers of Chinese snuff bottles concerns a highly special problem about these bottles that have the mark Guyue Xuan, Old Moon Pavilion. These are usually of glass, though porcelain specimens are known. The problems involved by the meaning of this inscription are so complicated that I shall simply refer readers to Mr. B.A. de Vere Bailey's article on the subject in Burlington Magazine 1935, and to the work of Miss Sheila York Hardy. And he says in the Transactions of the Oriental Ceramic Society, but I think it was obviously reproduced there. So, you know, at that point in the 1950s, this whole mystery and confusion and muddle was being recognized by people in relation to snuff bottles. Howard Hansford in 1954, in a glossary of Chinese art and archaeology, says, Guyue Xuan, a name of enameled glassware of the 18th century, transferred in error to certain finely executed porcelains of the Famille Rose, to which they showed a superficial resemblance. But this was sort of, this whole idea by this time was totally embedded in the psyche of ceramic collectors and of snuff bottle collectors. So, and Lilla Perry basically bought into this. So she had a whole chapter 8, on the mysterious Guyue Xuan. And it's wonderful to read, apart from, and including the fact that it has this great story about her selling a wonderful enamel bottle to somebody for $250, who then went to Martin Schoen and said, look what fantastic bottle I got out of Lilla Perry for only $250, when I think it's probably worth $2,000. And that person I know was Jerry Mack, because I have Jerry Mack's letters and he wrote about it. So I was able to piece all that together. And then of course, Martin Schoen went back to Lilla Perry and said, oh, I hear you gave a bottle away for a steal to Jerry Mack. So she's talking about, but anyway, I digress. She's talking about treating imperial wares in ceramics and imperial snuff bottles as being Guyue Xuan wares. But she's also treating enamel on glass bottles with Guyue Xuan marks as being lesser than the things that she's calling Guyue Xuan style, which is very confusing. So she says that, for example, all 3 of these bottles are Guyue Xuan bottles. The black enamel on glass on the right, which is one of only 2 known and is probably one of the finest imperial enamels, is 18th century and a palace enamel. There's one in private hands and there's one in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. That has a blue, well, they all have blue enamel Chenlong Nyanja marks on. None of them have Guyue Xuan marks on. The middle one is a wonderful bottle, but is Republic porcelain. And the one on the left has gone through various stages of being thought of as imperial in 18th century, then Ye Bengji, and I think it's been repatriated as 18th century and imperial now. So she's saying that all of these are Guyue Xuan style bottles, which they're clearly not. Here's one that is. Dr. Sherman Lee, in A History of Far Eastern Art, said in 1964, after Lily Perry's book, in the West they have been called Guyue Xuan, moon pavilion ware, a misnomer derived from a group of late 18th and 19th century glass bottles made for private use. And in 1971, Hugh Moss, in Snuff Bottles of China, slightly joins into the fray. He doesn't really discuss it much at that point, given that he's gone on to do most of the very valuable research about it. But he very briefly points out that there's so much confusion by this time over the whole subject that enamel on glass bottles with Guyue Xuan marks, which this one has, need to be separated as a group and studied without the larger group of imperial wares, and definitely without ceramics. He suggests that Guyue Xuan marked glass was made in the 18th century, but he states he has no evidence of it at that time. The characteristics he points out for Guyue Xuan marked glass are opaque white grounds, but also in turquoise, caramel, and black and purple colors, family-rose enamels, and occasional inscriptions. I chose this bottle, and it's an extraordinary bottle in a number of ways. It's got this family-rose decoration, but it's also, intriguingly, it's got the standard flower basket on one side, but on the other side, it's got fungi and crustaceans and mollusks and fish, and they're all lying on a bed of millet in this basket. Very unusually, there's a blue enamel neck border, and the base, and it's technically an overlay bottle as well, because the foot rim is blue glass, and the base is inscribed Guyue Xuan. There's a similar bottle in another collection, and I'm deliberately not saying where these collections are from, because this goes onto YouTube, so I want to protect us all a little bit. But there's a similar bottle in another collection that has a Qianlong Nianzhi mark on the bottom of it. The whole subject of the basket of flowers, it's found on snuff bottles because it's an emblem of one of the 8 Taoist immortals, one of the female immortals. In 1973, in Antique Collecting, Joanna Knox wrote an article about snuff bottles. And interestingly, she wrote quite a lot about Suzhou bottles, which we talked about last time. She didn't actually write anything about Guyue Xuan, but she does talk about, she has the descriptions of 2 Guyue Xuan style bottles underneath. And one, she says, is an ordinary quality bottle enameled in the colors in the Guyue Xuan style. She says, this type of bottle is not uncommon and was probably decorated in the late 19th or early 20th century. And in 1973, you could have had that one for £90. The one next to it, she says, is extremely fine, and she thinks could be 18th century or at least early 19th century, and that is £1,200. I'd take either of them for that amount at this point. And the bottle on the right is this bottle here, which was originally in the J&J. Sorry, I'm not going to say where it is. So in 1976, Hugh weighs in again in Imperial Command, and he says, the confusion which obscures this subject is epitomized in the extensive misuse of the simple hallmark Guyue Xuan Old Moon Pavilion, which has been thrust into greatness far above its station and against all reason. then squeezed, stretched, and strained in a succession of attempts to explain the anomalies of its erroneous use. I believe it's time to take a fresh look at these wares and hope this work will clear the ground in preparation for this. And then in his section on later non-imperial enameled glass, he suggests that Guyue Xuan refers to a private workshop or kiln in Beijing from which imperial wares were occasionally ordered from the late 18th through the 19th century. He says that some of these wares have Qianlong marks instead of Guyue Xuan marks. And he states categorically at this point that Guyue Xuan is no more than a simple hallmark which appeared on a small group of enameled glasswares and occasionally on other items. Also in 1976, Bob Stevens' The Collector's Book of Snuff Bottles came out. And by that time, snuff bottle people were kind of throwing their hands up and just not quite knowing what to say about it. But he said that the Guyue Xuan should simply be treated as a hallmark, even going so far as to say the whole term should be left alone, forgotten, and individual bottles should just be judged on their own merits. 2 years later, Hugh Moss jumps in again in an article in our journal, which is a long article over 20 pages and very, very comprehensive, where he mentions what Sheila York Hardy said and what Sherman Lee said. And at the time, he again concludes that this was a privately owned small enamel workshop or a collector's hallmark, that the pieces, mostly bottles, were the last quarter of the 18th century into the first half of the 19th century. And he suggests that they were made in Beijing. And at this time, he starts the suggestion perhaps within the palace, and also that the market for these bottles were the nobility. So that sort of idea then continued. It seemed that for the most part, the use of the Guyue Xuan label for imperial ceramics and imperial porcelain snuff bottles had dropped away, and that people were actually looking at the enamel on glass bottles with Guyue Xuan marks. And really, there was no research that until 1998. So that's 20 years later. Hugh does write quite a lot about it in the J&J book, but it doesn't advance anything really at that point. So 1998 was the sort of bombshell year, I guess. Peter Lamb and Humphrey Hui published a book of Humphrey's collection, The Imperial Connection. And in his article, Studio Marks in Imperial and Court-Related Snuff Bottles, Peter Lamb quotes Guo Bao Chang in 1977, and this is the translation. So this is before Hugh wrote his article. He said at that point, visits have been made to all of the palaces which are in existence, such as those in the Forbidden City. I just want to move this along. Known as Gugong. Those in the parks enclosing the 3 lakes, known as Sanhai, those in the Summer Palace, called Yiho Yuan, and those at Zhihou. But the search has been in vain. Researches have also been made into books and records that deal with palaces that were destroyed by fire, such as Changchun Yuan and Yuanming Yuan. But again, the effort has been fruitless. Collections of poems, other great literary works have been thoroughly examined, with no more encouragement. In the collection of poems of the Qianlong Emperor, practically every building in the palaces in and out of Peking has formed the subject for his poetical effusion. Among those so treated here are Meiyue Xuan and Taiyue Xuan, but no Guyue Xuan. It is obvious then that there is no pavilion of that name within the palace precincts or imperial parks, for otherwise the Emperor Qianlong would not have singled it out for neglect. However, he goes on to say, in 1981, there was a the first issue of a publication to commemorate the 120th anniversary of the destruction of the Yuan Yuan. And there was a report by two architects, He Chongyi and Zheng Zhaofeng, who in the 70s and early 80s they were absolutely intent on restoring the original plans of the Yuan Yuan. So these were the plans that were before the existing known plans that the Empress Dowager had the Yuan Yuan rebuilt. And the relevant part of this report is very important. The Jin Yuan, the Garden of Reflection, constructed in the 32nd year of Qianlong, 1767, was situated in the southeastern corner of the Changchun Yuan, stretching along the edge of a lake. The main hall was the Eran Jinyun, which was linked up to covered corridors to various buildings. In the far north was a two-story pavilion, Wanyun Ge. It was a library of books, paintings, and calligraphy, and was the second royal library in the Yuan Yuan. Guyue Xuan was located at the back of the main hall and was 5 columns in width. It was linked to the Tui Shenzai, which was designated as the bedroom chamber of the Qianlong Emperor after his retirement. But they make the remark that it was doubtful whether the emperor stayed there in his final years. So the Guyue Xuan finally has been discovered, and you can see it in the bottom diagram in the middle. Peter Lam goes on to discuss references related to the Jian Yuan, including a poem written by the Qianlong Emperor in 1771. So that's 4 years after the Guyue Xuan was built, and 4 years after the Jin Yuan was completed, where he mentioned that this garden was surrounded by water, which was the lake, and was clean and clear, especially viewed from mirrors in the pavilion. So the whole thing was as if surrounded by glass. So this was the reason for the name Jin Yuan, or Garden of Reflection. And you can see that it's in the Garden of Eternal Spring at the top is where the Jin Yuan is. It's also important to know that in the Yuan Yuan, there was a glass factory, and there had been since the Yongcheng emperor had set it up. And the Ruiguan, where the painting orders were handed out, was also in the Yuan Yuan. So you have a situation where anything that was made possibly for the Guyue Xuan pavilion, the Old Moon Pavilion, could have been made in the Yuan Yuan. It wasn't necessarily made in the enamel workshops in the Forbidden City. Peter Lam ends his this section of the book with this quote, which I find quite amusing. He said, "There is one thing we are certain of, is that the Guyue Xuan mark has absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Hu, the Hu family, or the fox spirit." Just to throw a little spanner in the works here, the scholar Xia Zhenqi, he gave a lecture in 2005 entitled, in Chinese, but Enameled Snuff Bottles Produced at the Palace Workshops. So he reported he found no mention of the name Guyue Xuan recorded in the imperial archives related to snuff bottles or any other types of enamelware produced in the enamel workshops in the 18th century. So just when you finally think that we've sorted it all out and the Guyue Xuan was this pavilion next to Qianlong's retirement home that produced these imperial wares, in 2005, we're told that there's no record in the imperial archives of Guyue Xuan as being enamel on glass wares. So this is the kind of bottle that we're talking about, which clearly has palace links. You can see it in the prunus and the way that the neck borders are done and everything, but it has the Guyue Xuan mark on the bottom. And that's different from this type of bottle, which has a Guyue Xuan mark incorrectly written on the base, which Peter Lam says that at some point in the Daguan reign, Guyue Xuan copies of imperial bottles were made outside of the Yuanming Yuan of very high quality. And I want to finish with a final slide. That was a like whistle-stop tour through Guyue Xuan. But I actually own this bronze seal. And it's of a mythical beast. And the seal says, Guyue Xuan ZHUREN on the base, master of the Old Moon Pavilion. So where that fits in, I have absolutely no idea at all. So as far as I'm concerned, the mystery still goes on, but at least we have cleared away the idea of imperial ceramics being part of the Guyue Xuan. Thank you.
Please send your questions through the chat.
Thank you, Claire. I think this has been outstanding. And I don't think we had a lot of questions. I think what you and I talked about prior to this lecture, there are amazing articles in the journal and they're all on the website. However, they cannot be easily searched. Yeah. So hopefully we'll get to that one day where you can type in a subject and you can pick it up, but not quite now. Maybe over email, we can sort of circulate the articles that you were referencing. You know, I think that would be nice because I go back, you know, we all have the stacks and stacks of the journals, but it's actually kind of nice to go on the website and just sort of pull it up right away and, you know, sort of have it there for your personal consumption.
Yeah, and you can actually find them quite easily when you scroll down, and you can see the articles on Guyue Xuan and the William Bragg album, which is interesting in itself, even though it doesn't mention Guyue Xuan. And then, you know, there's a number of articles either by me or by Hugh on enamel glass snuff bottles that will mention the Guyue Xuan. I think there's about 6 journals between 1978 and 2019 that reference the Guyue Xuan. But I can certainly put them in an email to Julia, and maybe she can distribute them to people.
And, you know, it's sort of funny, and I shared that with Claire the other day. Like, I was in the Metropolitan Museum about a couple of years ago, and I was in the bookstore, and I stumbled across this book that had a sort of a holistic rebuild of the Yuanming Yuan. So it was a sort of a software sort of pictures what would have, from what we know, what would have looked like, right? And I think that's something we can, you know, ultimately share as well. Bert is posting, the Freya porcelains on display are marked Imperial 18th century. Is there also the Moon Pavilion seal on those pieces?
No, those are, I'm glad that they are marked Imperial 18th century. So they need to rectify what's on their website, essentially. That there's no Old Moon Pavilion seal on those pieces. They're all reign marks. So, and actually, if you give me literally, if you talk amongst yourselves for less than a minute, I still have the journals out that I used, so I can just run and get them and tell you very quickly which ones they are. So.
Sure. I think we're all love to socialize for a couple of minutes.
Unmute yourselves. Everybody unmute yourselves.
Julia, and yes, unmute everybody. Julia? I think we need to
Yes.
unmute people.
Okay,
We can.
you can also unmute yourself. If you're comfortable.
Whoever is unmuted and wants to talk, go ahead.
Well, I would just like to send greetings to all of the familiar faces and even the unfamiliar ones. It's such a good idea that this took place, and it's kind of neat to see Edwin Palmer, who I guess is a long way away in the Seychelles, playing golf.
Okay, Claire is back.
I'm back. That was quick, right? So they are, winter 1978 was Hugh's article. Then spring 2006 is Mysteries of the Ancient Moon by Hugh. Winter 2006 was the Bragg illustrated album by Hugh, and that's obviously not about, it's only useful in that it doesn't mention Guyue Xuan for this subject, but it's very fascinating. Winter 2008 was an article by me on enamel glass snuff bottles. Autumn 2016 was the article, a very interesting article by Peter Lam on a glimpse from the Chinese archives, Qianlong enameled snuff bottles. And I found that, maybe I'm just a complete nerd, but I found that totally fascinating. And then autumn 2019 was another article by me on enameled glass snuff bottles.
I also wanted to say there was an interesting article, I don't remember what is the year, by Julian Thompson on imperial porcelains and the use of pink and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can, I noticed that. You can find that on the website too. But most of the, you know, the early, the magazines and like the Burlington Magazine and Antique Collector and stuff like that, I'm fortunate to have copies of.
As a matter of fact, I thought of maybe reprinting at this time Julian Thompson's article. That would be interesting as imperial porcelains that he had.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting.
Since obviously he had gotten permission from the Palace, National Palace Museum in Taipei to reproduce the bottles, as well as asking Julian King at Sotheby's when many of the objects were bottles. So that's another thought.
Paul, did you want to say something?
Me?
Yes.
No, I'm just enjoying it. Great job.
So what's the painting behind you? It looks very fascinating.
Oh, that's a Chinese scholar holding his prized possession, which is a white jade snuff bottle.
Oh, wonderful.
I don't know if you can see his hand. Let me
Wonderful.
see if I can lift it up and get it closer.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
All right.
Do we want to talk? I mean, we are very much in the time frame, so we have a little bit of time. And so, Claire, maybe do you want to talk about the idea for the next time around?
Yes, I'd love to. So next time around, we're going to do Henrik and I have discussed this, and we would like to do a completely different thing again. And we would like to basically have a sort of open seminar, and we want to base this along the lines of the last chapter of Bob Stevens' book, where the last chapter is favorites amongst the favored. And so we're going to ask people to think about, who want to participate, to think about what is their favorite snuff bottle, and join the Zoom seminar and be ready to talk a little bit about it or discuss it with us. And we would like everybody to keep it manageable. I mean, obviously, if 100 people turn up with their favorite snuff bottle, we're going to be there all day. So we want to keep it manageable. So we'll be asking people to let Julia know which snuff bottle they would like to discuss prior to the meeting, so that I can put them in groups in an order. So, you know, if 10 people have red overlay snuff bottles, then we'll talk about all of those together and do it that way to keep it a bit more cohesive. But we thought it would be fun for everybody. We thought it would be a little bit more social, and we just have to keep control of it so everybody's not jumping in.
And I think it's a very challenging question, right? So if you could only take one to the island, and you're stranded on an island, and you only could take one in a pocket, which one would it be? And it doesn't really matter.
To absolutely clarify, we're talking about one from our own collection.
Correct.
Well,
Yes.
Well, you could also have a theoretical one.
Oh, okay.
You could have it, I think. I don't know, Claire, specify the rules, but...
No, I think it can be from anywhere.
Yes.
Okay.
We just don't want your 10 favorites. We just want your one favorite.
Just one.
I will be trying to pick one favorite from my private collection. Although I can immediately think of bottles, you know, in other people's collections that I would love to talk about. But I think, you know, to actually have it in hand will be a good thing.
I think it would be preferable if it was, and if you don't want to do it, then you don't. As we said, we don't want to have 100 people. So, you know, if you don't feel comfortable, even though I like the idea of the theoretical bottle, but I think it takes us a little bit too far. So
we'll all be in the Palace Museum.
Yes.
But that's what we'd like to do for the next one, and I think that would be. I'm really interested in the different types of bottles that people find speak to them. You know, it's not always the most expensive bottle.
No.
It's not always the rarest bottle by any means. You know, I had a client years ago who had a brown agate bottle, very plain, and he called it his sexy bottle. And I have no idea why. I didn't want to question him too far. But he would sit with that bottle in the evening while he watched TV. So that was his favorite bottle, but it definitely wasn't the most important bottle by a long way in his collection, but it was his favorite. So
That the fondling bottle?
Yes, a fondling bottle. But I can see your eyebrows going here. So that's what we're going to do for the next one, and it's going to be on August the 23rd.
Which is a bit of a change from Saturday to Sunday, because we just want to see how that works, right?
Yes, and also allows somebody like Joey, for example, to be part of it, which he can't at the moment because of Shabbat.
And by the way, Joey made also snuff bottle history on the forum, because he posted a tuna salad recipe. So in case you don't have a tuna salad recipe, you should go and check out the forum.
The seminar will be at the same time.
At the same time, 8:30 on Sunday, August the 23rd.
11:30 on Eastern time.
11:30 Eastern time.
And wherever else you are.
Yes. So I hope
that happens to be my birthday and Pierre's birthday. We were both born on the same day in 1944.
That's amazing.
You're twins. Okay, so we'll have to sing happy birthday to you then.
Yes.
Exactly.
Perhaps you should turn up with a bottle that you bought for your birthday for yourself or something
Well,
like that.
Well, I was at Eldred's at most of my birthdays because their sale was the end of August, and so I bought bottles, a lot of bottles on my birthday over the years.
Anyway,
I'm writing that down so that maybe I'll have a birthday cake for breakfast.
A virtual cake. That's good. It's calorie free.
Cake.
Calorie free virtual cake.
So
you can just use a photograph of one.
Yes.
And also, like, I mean, we appreciate, like, you know, I mean, Claire really put in so much work, and we're really sort of indebted, and this is wonderful that we're doing this. But also any feedback that you can send to Julia and us of what you look for in the future would be helpful. So I think it will be a good way to shape this, because I think we're in it till next year, hopefully at a minimum. So in the meantime, we just want to make this new venue of technology work. And I think it's a good way. And then I actually had this discussion yesterday with somebody for local chapters to get together, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and the subject after this one, the subject for the end of September, I've already actually started work on, and that's
you
going
mean
to
August? Do you mean?
No,
August we have
the next one after this.
Sure.
One after the August one,
Okay.
is going to be probably more like today's, because I'm going to do a seminar on poems on snuff bottles. So I've already started.
And we'll all have read your book.
You might not. It was so dark. You might not all turn up at that point.
And then I think also when it comes to later in autumn and October, I think we're trying to do a bit of a virtual conference, but that's still to be decided. But I think it'll be a nice way of not skipping a beat, let's put it that way. So, and I think it will be nice. And I think the idea would be, you know, doing it over a weekend where we have a Friday lecture, a Saturday lecture, a Sunday lecture, and we have sort of a social happy hour through Zoom on Saturday, you know, so that would be sort of the idea, but to be decided.
Virtual convention in the end of October.
Yes, because we had so much fun all these years. Why should we stop now?
And we're still here.
Correct.
Perhaps we'll get Henrik and Robert to make a convention cocktail.
Oh, sure. We can do that. We can have the ICSBS cocktail. We'll figure one out. Recipe to be distributed. All right. Any finishing, who wants to have the last word?
I want to say thanks to everybody who participated, to Claire, to Henrik, and to Julia.
We have some gold. What type are you looking for?
Bob's trying to sell something out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It was wonderful.
How many grams do you want?
Thank you. Have a great day.
Everybody
Bye-bye.
have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank
for
you, Claire.
participating.
See you on August the 23rd.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
It's probably 24.